Hello everybody, welcome to this week's lecture. Today we are going to get depressed and we are going to speak about the Great Depression. A depression that rocked not only the United States but the world in general. As we saw in our last lecture on the 1920s, the 1920s was a period of economic prosperity. It was a time in U.S. history when the United States economy was booming. We were producing over 50%, as I recall, over 50% of the world's industrial goods, and there were a few select people who were making a lot of wealth. This was not true for everybody, as we will see, but there were some people who were making a lot of money. And so generally speaking, the 1920s was a time of prosperity. But unfortunately, that prosperity had some negative consequences, as we're going to see. In fact, the amount of commodities that we produced became so great that it began a cycle of layoffs, because in factories, commodities were being overproduced and those things could not be sold, and so those who built those things were laid off, and therefore people had less and less money to actually spend. This, however, did not stop speculation and purchasing of stocks, as we will see. And for these reasons, among others that we will talk about, the Great Depression is going to come about. Now, the event that ultimately sparks the Great Depression is the stock market crash, which occurred on October 29th, 1929, a day known as Black Tuesday. Now, while that's the thing that causes the crash, the question we do have to ask ourselves is this: what caused the stock market to crash in the first place? And that's really the central question I want to look at today. So let's go ahead and dive into this and see what we can get. Here we go. All right, it says, at the end of the 1920s, the United States boasted the largest economy in the world. And this should be fairly obvious. And if you remember back to the two films I had you watch at the end of the 1920s lecture, right? The two films which gave an overview of the 1920s, right? What we see in there is that there is a lot of different things being made, vacuum cleaners, cars, for example. And there are a lot of things that people are purchasing, especially on credit. And so the United States economy is doing pretty well. It says here that with the destruction wrought by World War I, Europeans struggled while Americans flourished. And indeed, many Europeans began to collect loans and take loans from the United States. And that, in fact, helps to explain why it was a world depression, because these European nations, among others, were connected to the United States economically because they were borrowing money from us. It says, upon succeeding to the presidency, Herbert Hoover predicted that the United States would soon see the day when poverty was eliminated. And this is an interesting thing because, of course, Herbert Hoover's entire presidency is just riddled with the horrors of the Great Depression. In fact, Herbert Hoover would go on to say that there was nothing fundamentally flawed with the American economy, that it was a sound economy, and that if people would just, communally help one another, then we could get out of the Depression. And we'll talk more about his philosophy here in a little bit. But ultimately, Herbert Hoover did very little to bring governmental aid to the people during the Great Depression. He rested on a philosophy known as voluntarism. He brought up as a Quaker, there was this sort of idea that communities pulled together during hard times and helped one another out. And so this is sort of his philosophy as well. It's not the government's job to get you out of this problem. Voluntarily work with one another, right? And part of his issue is that he's just not really akin, or attuned rather, to what's going on. He doesn't quite grasp the economic realities of the day. And despite Herbert Hoover's idea that the world would one day see a time when poverty was eliminated, it says, then in a moment of apparent triumph, everything fell apart. The stock market crash of 1929 touched off a chain of events that plunged the United States into its longest and deepest economic crisis of its history, probably only seconded by the recession that was wrought on by the housing market crash of 2007. So let's move on. Now, as I've already alluded to, I say here that it is far too simplistic to view the stock market crash as the single cause of the Great Depression. Indeed, this is the thing that started the Depression to begin, right? I mean, it's the thing that inaugurated the Great Depression. But we have to ask that question of what caused the stock market to crash to begin with, because that's really the causes of the Depression. It says a healthy economy can recover from such a contraction when the stocks begin to be sold. It says long-term underlying causes, however, sent the nation into a downward spiral of despair. It said first, so let's dive into what are some of the things that caused the stock market to crash. What are some of the things that caused the economy to be weak, and when the stock market crashed, the economy couldn't return? Well, first, American firms earned record profits during the 1920s and reinvested much of that money into further expansion. And what that means is that rather than providing higher wages for workers, which if you recall, Henry Ford actually paid his workers higher wages, right? $5 a day, right? Most companies didn't do that. And so the actual amount of real wages that the general American worker is earning during the 1920s is relatively low, okay? Companies are doing well during the 1920s. Production is occurring. Trade is occurring. But much of the wealth that is being accumulated in the hands of a few people, and it's being reinvested into corporate expansion. Okay? It says by 1929, companies had expanded to the bubble point. It said workers could no longer continue to fuel further expansion, and so a slowdown was inevitable. It goes on to state that while corporate profits skyrocketed, wages increased incrementally, which widened the distribution of wealth. In other words, you have a select few, a small group of people who are making lots of money. Corporations seem to be doing well, but the general worker is not making as much money, right? It also means that these corporations have overproduced commodities to the ceiling, if you will, and so there has to be a general slowdown in the production of goods at any given factory. This could result, and it did result, in people being laid off. Okay? Moving on. It says here that the richest 1% of Americans owned over a third of all American assets. So that would be 33.3% of the economy, and was rested in the hands of the richest 1% of the Americans, right? It says such wealth concentrated in the hands of a few limits economic growth, right? You need to more evenly distribute that wealth across the spectrum of society. It says the wealthy tended to save money that might have been put back into the economy if it were spread among the middle and lower classes, right? The idea here is that if this 1% had increased wages incrementally, if this 1% had given bonuses, right, then there would have been more people who had more money to spend, and generally the middle and lower classes would have pumped that resources back into the economy in order to support it. That didn't happen. Okay? It says middle class Americans had already stretched their debt capacities by purchasing automobiles and household appliances on credit, or what we also refer to as installment plans. And we saw this in the films with the 1920s, right? People in the 1920s were consumers. They're consuming commodities, whether they actually have purchased those goods or whether they're purchasing them on credit, right? Americans are consumers during the 1920s, and so they've stretched their budgets far too thin. And so by the time that the Depression begins to roll around, there's no money left to be pumped back into the economy to shore it up. And those who have those kind of resources are not necessarily pumping them back into the economy. They're reinvesting them in their own corporations, if you will. So this is an example of one of the causes of the Depression. It's an unequal distribution of wealth and the inability of general American society to pump money back into the economy. Okay? Moving forward. It says there were also fundamental structural weaknesses in the American economic system, right? So in addition to what we've just mentioned, there was also some structural weaknesses. It says, for example, banks operated without guarantees to their customers, right? Today you have FDIC backing, insurance on your money, right? Most banks will insure your money so that if a crisis hits, there's some type of insurance that your money isn't just going to disappear. Well, during the Great Depression, there is no FDIC backing. There's no insurance on your money. And banks are simply just loaning money out without any real guarantee that they can get that money back. And in fact, banks overextended themselves. They were loaning money out hand over fist, assuming that because the economy was doing well, the economy would always be doing well, and it didn't matter how much money they lent out because clearly they're going to reap some type of benefit. And so banks operated without guarantees to their customers, creating a climate of panic when things got tough. Because when there's no guarantee and the economy begins to tank, the first thing you're going to see is a run on the bank. People are going to run to the bank to withdraw their monies. But when there are no reserves held and there is no insurance or guarantees, the bank runs out of money, and if you didn't happen to show up soon enough, the money could be gone. Because the reality is that banks do not just sit on people's money. They lend it out, and if they do not have it, they do not have it. And this means that banks will shut down, and when banks shut down, loans aren't given out, and when loans aren't given out, the economy begins to suffer because businesses aren't working. Furthermore, it says few regulations were placed on banks, and they lent money to those who speculated recklessly in the stock market. It says agricultural prices had already been low during the 1920s, leaving farmers unable to spark any sort of recovery. It says when the Depression spread across the Atlantic, Europeans bought fewer American products, which caused additional problems for the American economy. Okay? So on one hand, one of the causes of the Great Depression is this unequal distribution of wealth, right? 1% of the population holds 33.3 or 1/3% of all assets in the United States, and they're not necessarily reinvesting the money that they are making into raising the wages of their workers. And in fact, they're having to lay off workers because of overproduction, which means if you're laid off, you're not spending money anyways, right? We've also got this issue of there is some structural weaknesses in the way that banks are working. They're overextending themselves, they're loaning money out, they're not insuring money, there's no guarantees, right? And because of the economy sort of tanking as it was, particularly in the agricultural sector, farmers aren't able to pay back their loans. Okay? So these are just some of the reasons why the market is going to crash and why the depression is going to come on. Continuing forward. It says here that when President Hoover was inaugurated, the American economy was what I call a house of cards, right? It's sort of standing, but one slight breeze is going to knock it all over. It says, unable to provide the proper relief from hard times, Hoover's popularity decreased as more and more Americans lost their jobs. Now, I say here that he's unable to provide the proper relief. The reality is that Hoover was unwilling to provide the proper relief. Again, Hoover did not believe it was the government's job to interfere with the economy, to interfere with the problems of the day, right? Hoover is working under this idea of laissez-faire government, right? Let the local and state governments fix these problems. Let communities fix these problems. Churches, peacetime organizations, right? His whole idea is voluntarism. And not to get too far ahead, but this is one of the reasons why Franklin Roosevelt will just defeat him, horribly in the 1932 election, because Franklin Roosevelt is willing to try something. He's willing to cut people checks. He's willing to do what he called a New Deal, and we'll talk more about that New Deal later. Hoover, on the other hand, just looks sort of lackluster and unwilling to help and unwilling to compromise, right? It says, unfortunately, his minimalist approach to government intervention made little impact on the actual depression. The economy shrank with each successive year of his presidency. He goes on to say that as middle-class Americans stood in the same soup lines previously graced only by the nation's poorest, right, the entire social fabric of the United States was forever altered. Okay? And, for Hoover's lackluster approach to the Depression, he's really given a bad rap as a president. He's considered one of the worst presidents because, frankly, he was just unwilling to work with the people. And he made some poor decisions along the line, as we will see. But, this could also be another reason why the Depression was perpetuated, right? There is no adoption of a policy in the Hoover administration that, hey, what we're experiencing here is something different than we've ever had before, and perhaps government intervention is necessary in this particular circumstance. Okay, I don't want to get on my high horse or preach at you too much, so let's move forward. All right, it says it was a boom time for the stockholder, right? Stockholders were making lots of money during the 1920s. That is up until the market crashed. It says stock prices soared to record levels. Millionaires were made overnight, right? And for those of you who are not familiar with how this works, basic stock is this, right? You purchase stock when the stock is low. So let's take a company and let's go with Microsoft, right? Or Apple. And so let's say, you purchase one share of stock. So you buy one stock in the company, and let's say you purchase that stock for $5, okay? And then let's say, over the next 3 or 4 years, the company is doing really, really well. So you have decided to purchase more stock, and so you've done that, right? And now the stock is beginning to increase in value. So, now you're paying $15 per share of stock, okay? And then that keeps going up and up and up. The value of the stock increases as more and more people buy stock, okay? That's how stock values increase. More and more people buy, okay? There comes a point in this increasing of value where people get a little itchy about the value of the stock, because whatever goes up inevitably must come back down, right? And so, you bought your stock for $5, and then you bought some more stock at $15, and now, 4 years later, each of your stock is worth $300 a share. And so you decide to sell your stock, and that's fine. You can do that, and you've made a lot of money, okay? The problem with the stock market is that if everybody started selling their shares of stock at the same time, it would cause the value of that particular stock to decrease, okay? And that happens in the market. The problem with the stock market during the 1920s is that people were purchasing stock on what we call margin. And if you go to the bottom of this slide here, it says, fueling the rapid expansion was the risky practice of buying stock on margin. And what a margin purchase is that it allows a person to borrow up to 75% the value of the stock, and maybe you only put in 25% of the stock's actual value. In other words, it's sort of like purchasing a car. You go in, you put a down payment on the car, but the reality is when you drive off the lot, you don't own that car. The bank does, right? So if something were to happen where they needed to reclaim their money for whatever loss they may have to reclaim it, it would be the bank's responsibility to repo your car. Well, during the 1920s, people were buying stock in that sort of way. They would put a down payment of about 25% of the stock's value and then borrow up to 75, sometimes even 90% of the stock's value from a loan officer or from a stockbroker, which means that the stockbroker actually owns the stock, not the person whose name it's in. So when the stock market began to crash in 1929, stockbrokers began to unload stock quickly in order to recover some of their losses. In the end, they got some money back and you would get none, because ultimately you didn't really own the stock. And this is what we call excess speculation, because in that economy, the stock looks like it's doing really, really well because lots of people are buying various types of stock. The problem is that there's not actual money supporting those stocks because most of that money has been borrowed. And so when stocks begin to plummet, that money, which, the value of the stock, which it says, it's at some $100,000, what have you, right? It's not actually worth that much because there's not that much money in the market. I hope that makes sense to you. Let me read through this and we'll move on. It says, although the 1920s were marked by growth in stock values, the last 4 years saw an explosion in the market. In 1925, the total value of the New York Stock Exchange was $27 billion. By September of 1929, that figure skyrocketed to $87 billion. This means that the average stockholder more than tripled the value of the stock portfolio he or she was lucky enough to possess. And again, most of the time, a lot of time, they were possessing those stock markets, or they were possessing those stock portfolios on margin, purchasing them on margin. Okay, moving on. It goes on to state here that stockbrokers and even banks funded this reckless speculation, okay? Americans have this sort of idea that when the times are going well, then they sort of convince themselves that times will always go well, right? The problem with this theory is that whatever comes up always comes down at some point, right? There was this mythological belief that, that Americans had, evolved or progressed into a period of economic prosperity that would never end. And so banks and stockbrokers said, hey, we'll lend out money to you. You know, yeah, you're going to pay 20% interest rates on these loans, but we'll lend out your money to you because we're pretty confident that, you know, the market is always going to be doing well. Okay? It says borrowers were often willing to pay 20% interest rates on loans, being dead certain that the risk would be worth the reward. It says the lender was so certain that the market would rise that such transactions became commonplace, despite warnings by the Federal Reserve Board against the practices. It says although the workings of the New York Stock Exchange can be quite complex, one simple principle governs the price of stock. When an investor believes a stock is a good value, they are willing to pay more for a share and its value rises. When traders believe the value of a security will fall, they cannot sell it and as it high of a price, so therefore they begin to drop it and sell it out for a lower price. It says if all investors do this at once, the market shrinks completely. Okay? And that's what happened in 1929. The market shrank because thousands of people began to sell stock quickly because the price of the stock, or what we call the security, its value wasn't as high as it had seemed to be. Okay? This is another major cause of the Great Depression. People are purchasing stock on margin, making the market look artificially high. This is a similar situation as what happened in the United States in the 2007 market crash. People were purchasing homes for crazy amounts of money with ridiculous loans, and you know, loan officers and loan agencies and banks were dropping interest rates by 1/3%, 1/4%, 0.5%, right? Time and time again, allowing the market to look artificially high. Okay, then in October, all of these things are going to culminate together and cause a major breakdown. It says on October 24th, 1929, a day known as Black Thursday, a massive sell-a-thon began. Okay, so on October 24th, 1929, which is a Thursday, there was a major move to sell tons of stock. Okay, and it looked like the market was going to drop and dip. Okay, it says by the late afternoon, however, wealthy financiers like J.P. Morgan pulled millions of dollars together and they began to pump it into the economy in order to shore up the market, because on that day stocks were being sold very quickly and the market was beginning to dip. In order to protect the market from crashing, Morgan and others pumped millions of dollars into the economy to shore it up, to support it, right? The problem was that by the next day on Friday, the market looked stabilized and Morgan and others withdrew their money, creating sort of a floorless market, a floorless stock market, right? So that it could easily drop down. And of course it does. It says, but the bottom fell out of the market on Tuesday, October 29th. It says a record 16 million shares were exchanged for smaller and smaller values as the day progressed. For excuse me. For some stocks, no buyers could be found at any price. It didn't matter what, and so you lose everything. It says by the end of the day, panic had erupted, and the next few weeks continued the downward spiral. In a matter of 10 short weeks, the value of the entire market was cut in half. If we go to my book, America, A Narrative History, it says some speculators who got out of the market went back in for bargains, but found themselves caught in a slow, tedious erosion of values. By March 1933, the value of stocks on the New York Stock Exchange was less than 1/5 of the value at the market's peak. Okay? Now, I quickly went over the causes of the Great Depression here. What I want you to do now is there's a film there. Go ahead and click on that, and that's going to sort of cover some of this again, and it might say things in a way that makes more sense. It's also going to provide some new information that I didn't cover in this lecture. So watch that film, and hopefully by the time you're done there, you'll have a good sense of what it was that caused the stock market to crash. All right? So go ahead and watch that now, and then move on to the next slide. Okay, what you see here is obviously a graph of what the stock market looked like from 1927 to 1933. And you can see from 1927, right, the stock just rapidly rises, right, until eventually in October it drops. And you can see that Black Thursday drop here at the tip. If you go to the very tip of that graph and it sort of dips and then levels off and then does a drastic drop, that initial dip is Black Thursday. And then the big drop is Black Tuesday. That's when the 16 million shares were sold. And so that economy, you can see it never really comes back. And what you're seeing here is the economy essentially during Herbert Hoover's administration from Black Tuesday forward to 1933, after which point FDR will be president and implement his New Deal. And that stated, the New Deal doesn't actually get us out of the Depression. World War II does. But this is sort of a visual of what that looked like. So hopefully by this point you have a decent sense of what caused the Depression. So now let's take a look at some of the ramifications and some of the things that are going on with it. Alright, it says, when the stock market crashed, few Americans believed that a decade-long depression was underway. It says, after all, only 4 million Americans had money invested on Wall Street. Thus, 90% of American households owned no shares of stock. But the reality is you didn't have to have resources in the stock market for the economy to affect you, right? You didn't have to, for example, own a home in the crash of 2007 to have the economy affect you. And so, it does affect many people. This is President Herbert Hoover quickly addressed the nation, professing his faith in the soundness of the American economy. Right? And he says this over and over again. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with the economy. It's a sound economy, he argued. And the reality is that's not true. That's bunk. It says, but soothing words were clearly not enough to stop the shrinking of a deeply flawed national economic system. Right? And the reality is as we look at this particular historical event, it's important to recognize, and that's why I keep bringing it back to the 2007 crash, is that we have to understand that there are similarities between the two, that these are not two completely divergent events that have nothing to speak to each other about, right? There's a lot of similarities, and this is one of those times when history can very much shape the way we should and ought to think about our present circumstances and the way that the economy works today. So just bear that in mind as we continue to go through this. Alright, it says here that the stock market crash had many short-term, it also had some long-term consequences, but it does have some short-term consequences, some immediate consequences. It says, for example, banks that extravagantly lent money to future traders to buy stock on margin found that many of those loans would go unpaid, right? We even saw this in the crash, that the last Great Recession that we had, right? That there were certain banks that had to be bought out. Because when banks close or shut down, business shuts down, it's not good for the economy. And so what happened during the Depression here is that one of the short-term immediate consequences was that banks began to shut down. Tons of banks, hundreds of banks began to close their doors, and they couldn't loan money out anymore because frankly the people that they had lent money out to couldn't pay it back. It says consequently, a rash of bank failures swept the nation. Says this had a tremendous ripple effect on the economy. If a working class family was unfortunate enough to have their savings held in trust by a failed bank, too bad for them, their money is gone. It's lost for good. Now, one of the interesting things about this is one of the long-term consequences is that this really freaked out a lot of people who lived during the Depression. And perhaps you have grandparents that you know of that lived during the Depression. Maybe they're gone, maybe they're still living. But there are some people who lived during the Depression who they refuse to put their money back in banks, and instead they'll just shove it underneath their mattress or they'll keep it in their dresser drawer or something, because for them, they are remembering the fact that they lost everything because it was in a bank and a bank that failed. And so it would be best to have something as opposed to nothing. Now today, these types of things wouldn't happen because there is FDIC insurance guarantees, right? There are reserves of monies held by banks that, allow for them to deal with these types of economic crises. But, it's just interesting to note that, the short-term consequence of a failed bank had a long-term consequence of people being afraid of banks because they had lost all their money in that moment when the bank shut down, okay? And that's why I think, in the last time we saw in 2007, 2008, what have you, right? Banks were being purchased because they don't want to see banks close. It's not good. Okay, so that's one of the short-term consequences. Moving forward. It says, as Americans saw banks close and savings disappear, less money was spent on goods and services, right? Of course it is, right? If you don't have any money, you're not going to go out and purchase luxury goods. You're going to purchase only those necessary items, right? Or you're going to pay off debt, what have you, you know? It says, many consumers who had bought the new conveniences of the golden 20s on the installment plan or credit, they were now unable to make their payments. And this is important because all those companies who had sold vacuum cleaners and cars and what have you, right? Now they're not getting the money back because, right, they sold these items on credit and now it's time to pay that bill and people can't afford to pay the bill. And so now the vacuum cleaning company is going to have to shut down and lay off all its workers. And so what you have is sort of a cyclical problem here, okay? It says businesses began to lay off workers to offset their losses. Many manufacturers had overproduced and created huge inventories of goods that they simply could not unload. They could not sell them, and therefore the entire system continued to shut down. It says unemployment brought even less savings and spending, and the economy slowed yet another notch. The downward spiral continued into 1933. The 87 billion 1929 New York Stock Exchange was worth a mere 15 billion in 1932. Okay, so the stock itself, the stock exchange, is dropping. Corporations and companies are not making their money. It also says here that unemployment rose from 1.5 million Americans in 1929 to a debilitating 12 million Americans in 1932. And really, 1932, 1933 was sort of the peak of the Great Depression. Things got slightly better, or at least they became more palatable to people. I mean, that's one of the things that FDR really did. It wasn't necessarily that he made the Depression better, it's that he made it more palatable to people, right? Hoover is doing nothing. He's not really helping out. Franklin Roosevelt, on the other hand, really does a lot to try and convince people that he cares about them, that he's doing something for them, right? Where Hoover, not so much. Okay, going forward. It says despair swept the nation. In addition to the nationwide 25% unemployment rate, many laborers were forced to choose between wage cuts or being let go. Right? I mean, the idea here is that you're now going to be told that your wages will be cut, so I guess you could take that and still have some kind of a job, or maybe you're going to be taking less hours. Or you could quit and go in search of another job. The problem is that during the Depression, everybody's looking for better work or more work or a job, right? So you're competing with a lot of people, okay? It says most people who retained their jobs saw their income shrink by a third. Soup kitchens and charity lines, previously unknown to the middle class, were unable to meet the growing demand for food. I think it's also important to recognize the social ramifications of this, right? As particularly for men. Because the societal norm for men at this time is they bring home the bacon and mom cooks that bacon, right? The problem is that men can't live up to their societal expectation, which is provide food and resources for your family because they don't have jobs. And so this really has a significant impact upon men specifically because they're unable to live up to what their expectation is. And this results in suicide rates, crime rates, alcoholism. You see abandonment rates increase, divorce rates increase. I mean, all sorts of negative consequences are resulting from this economic crisis. And when I say that, I mean there are a lot of negative social, societal consequences. It says, desperate for income, thousands performed odd jobs from taking in laundry to collecting and selling apples. Right? It says college professors in New York City drove taxi cabs, and citizens of Washington, right? They would light forest fires and then be called upon to put them out and get paid for it, right? I mean, this is one way, I guess, that you could definitely increase your revenue. Okay. Another area of economic development that grew at this time was prostitution, which is probably the world's oldest profession. You know, because here you're allowed, I mean, you can make money that way, right? And you know, there's an ethical discussion that could occur here, but the reality is that the numbers don't lie. People increase, specifically women increase the occupation of prostitution in order to eat. Going back to my book, America, it says, many slept on park benches or in back alleys. Others congregated in makeshift shelters in vacant lots. Thousands of desperate men in search of jobs rode the rails, quote unquote, These hobos, or tramps as they were derisively called, sneaked onto empty railway cars and rode from town to town looking for work. During the winter, homeless people wrapped themselves in newspapers to keep themselves warm. And because Hoover became the focal point of the Depression, right? I mean, obviously we can't blame Hoover for causing the Depression, but he didn't do anything to help it make it better, right? People would call these newspaper blankets Hoover blankets, right? It says some grew weary of their grim fate and ended their lives. Suicide rates soared during the 1930s, right? Okay? Life is difficult as a result of the Depression, okay? No doubt about it. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so one of the things I now want to sort of bring about and give you sort of a case study, and it's going to be a real quick case study, is, you know, in addition to suicide rates and having to sell apples and what have you that we just mentioned, you know, difficult times, as was being experienced during the Great Depression, can result in revolutionary ideologies or rebellion. And there was a sort of rebellion, if you want to call it that, that occurred during the Great Depression, known as the Bonus March or the Bonus Army. And so let me read through this for you here a second, and you can get a sort of sense of what's going on. It says, although the United States had little history of massive social upheaval or coup d'etat attempts, and coup d'etat is a French word which means blow of state. It's this idea that there's a quick seizure of power, a quick toppling or overthrow of the government, right? The United States doesn't have an example of that, but during the Great Depression, there was always this fear that you might overthrow the government because the government wasn't doing anything to make life better, and if we could simply overthrow it, then right, things might be better. I'm sure there's people who thought this, and Herbert Hoover definitely believed that those involved in the Bonus March were these sort of social upheavals, right? It says, as bread riots and shanty towns grew in number, what they called Hoovervilles, shanty towns were also referred to as Hoovervilles, and I'll show you a picture or two of these. It says, when these things began to grow, many people began to seek alternatives to the status quo. Demonstrations in the nation's capital increased as Americans grew increasingly weary with President Hoover's perceived inaction. Okay? It says the demonstration that drew the most national attention was the Bonus Army March of 1932. Right? Ultimately, this march was not a social upheaval. It was not a coup attempt, although Herbert Hoover and his administration attempted to convince Americans that that's exactly what this was. He wanted to convince Americans that there were communists and anarchists and what have you among the group of people who were marching in this bonus march, and that their intention was to overthrow the government, right? That's what he wants to convince the people. The reality is that the majority of people who are in this bonus march were World War I vets who had been promised a bonus of $1,000 to be paid out in 1945, and because of the economic situation, they wanted that money earlier, so they marched to Washington to ask for the bonus. Now, let me explain something to you. At this point in history, there is no GI Bill, there is no, there's nothing in place to help veterans after war. You know, today we have that, and it's important to understand that the bonus marchers help to bring about these types of policies, right? They help to bring about veterans' benefits, okay? Because here what we found is that you have veterans who were not treated well, and so we believe that they should be treated well, okay? Now, again, I'm preaching a little bit, but ultimately all these gentlemen wanted was to get their bonus early so that they could eat, and Hoover mistreated them, calling them communists and anarchists and what have you. So, let me run through this real quick and we can see what happens. Now, by the way, this march occurs in 1932, which is the year that, right in the middle of Hoover's election against FDR. And, you know, the main thing that does Hoover in is FDR's charisma, right? FDR is extremely charismatic, okay? But this doesn't help Hoover in any way, okay? All right, here we go. It says, in 1924, Congress rewarded World War I vets with certificates redeemable in 1945 for $1,000 each. It says, by 1932, however, many of these former servicemen had lost their jobs and fortunes in the early days of the Depression, and they were simply marching into Washington to ask Congress to redeem those bonuses early. Hence they get the name the Bonus Army, or the Bonus Marchers, right? It says, led by Walter Waters of Oregon, the so-called Bonus Expeditionary Force, okay, set out for the nation's capital. Hitching rides, hopping trains, and hiking finally brought the Bonus Army, now 15,000 strong, into the capital in June of 1932. It says, although President Hoover refused to address them, the veterans did find an audience with a congressional delegation. And so instead of addressing Herbert Hoover, right, they meet this congressional delegation. And they basically ask the congressional delegation to meet the demand to, pay off on these certificates early. Okay, it says, soon a debate began in the Congress over whether to meet the demonstrators' demands, right? And in the end, what the government is going to choose to do is to not meet these demands, which is, I guess, is their prerogative. But the way that the government went about not meeting those demands was incredibly horrifying. Moving forward. It says that as deliberation continued on Capitol Hill, the Bonus Army built a shanty town across the Potomac River in Anacostia Flats. When the Senate rejected their demands on June 17th, most of the veterans dejectedly returned home, but some remained behind. It says several thousand remained in the capital, and they remained in Anacostia Flats, and they remained there with their families because there was nowhere else for them to go, right? It says the Bonus Army conducted itself with decorum and spent their vigil unarmed. So they're not armed, they're not being aggressive, they're not, taunting people and being rude, right? They're just there as a sort of demonstration, which constitutionally they're allowed to do, right? They're allowed to do that via the First Amendment. It says, however, many believed them to be a threat to national security, and Herbert Hoover was one of the individuals who believed them to be a threat to national security. So on July 28th, Washington police began to clear the demonstrators from the Capitol, to remove them. Okay, let's move forward. In the process, it says, in the process, 2 men were killed as tear gas and bayonets assailed the Bonus Marchers. And again, the majority of these men are World War I veterans. Fearing rising disorder, Hoover ordered an army regiment into the city under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur. Okay, Dwight D. Eisenhower and Patton will also be among those who go in under Douglas's command. It says the army, complete with infantry, cavalry, and tanks, rolled into Anacostia Flats, forcing the Bonus Army to flee. MacArthur then ordered the shanty town that they had built there to be burnt to the ground. Okay? And the question that we have to ask ourselves today is this how you treat your veterans? Is this the way that veterans should be treated, right, after they sacrificed for the liberty of Americans? It says many Americans were outraged. Nonetheless, Hoover maintained that political agitators, anarchists, and communists dominated the mob. It says, but facts contradict his claims. 9 out of the 10 Bonus Marchers were indeed veterans, and 20% were disabled. Despite the fact that the Bonus Army was the largest march on Washington up to that point in history, Hoover and MacArthur clearly overestimated the actual threat posed to national security. As Hoover campaigned for re-election that summer, his actions turned an already sour public opinion of him even further, right? Completely horrifying, okay? Now, I want to read to you a portion of a book. It's called The Bonus Army, an American Epic, written by Paul Dickinson and Thomas B. Allen. Again, The Bonus Army, an American Epic. And on page 6, they ask the following question. They say, how could this all be forgotten? The question dogged us at the outset of our project. Early in our research, we obtained a copy of a thesis written in 1994 by a woman, a young scholar, who examined the Bonus Army in the context of the American memory and in the pages of textbooks and 20th century histories. Why, she asked, had historians seen the Bonus March as an insignificant event? And the reason why, again, these people are asking this question is because the Bonus March had really not been seen as an important event. It was sort of skirted under the rug a little bit, as if it wasn't very significant. And the reality is that it is incredibly important. Why had they ignored, I'm back to the book, why had they ignored the impact of the largest and most sustained public demonstration of the Great Depression, Her conclusion was that the Bonus Army had been looked upon narrowly as an incident leading to the defeat of Herbert Hoover, instead of what it actually was, which was a major historic event. It says, following her lead, we tracked that change and discovered an odyssey that began in Portland in 1932, wove through the Great Depression and into World War II, and returned finally to Washington, where in June 1944, Roosevelt signed into law the GI Bill. Okay? The reality is that the Bonus Army is important because one of the things that it does is it helps to explain why there are certain types of benefits for veterans, right? Okay. Now the GI Bill, as we will talk about a little bit later, it had other reasons for its creation, but part of it was this idea that, look at the bonus marchers, right? There has to be a way to treat veterans better than that. Okay? And again, I could get preachy on this, but I think this is a particular incident that needs to be highlighted, and that's why I do it here. So, with that, let's continue on. Alright, it says here that undoubtedly the fault of the Great Depression was not Hoover's, right? We can't blame, the Depression on Herbert Hoover. Yeah, he's part of the political institution prior to the Great Depression, but he's not the cause of it. But he's also not, inspiring confidence either. It says, but as the years of his presidency passed and the country slipped deeper into its quagmire, he would receive great blame. And he receives great blame in a number of ways, right? It says, urban shanty towns were dubbed Hoovervilles. And I'm going to show you a couple pictures of these Hoovervilles here in a second. Newspapers used by the destitute as bundling for warmth became known as Hoover blankets, right? Pockets turned inside out where there was no money in those pockets became known as Hoover flags. Somebody had to be blamed, and it might as well be the president, right? And we sort of see this even today, right? The president gets blamed for everything, right? No matter what you do, 50% of the population hates you, right? And such was the case here for Hoover. Now what I want to do is I want to show you a couple pictures of these Hoovervilles so you can get a sense of how people were living. So let's look at them. Alright, so this is a shanty shack, right? Part of a shantyville. You can see there's other shacks in the back, part of what we call the Hooverville. This is how people were living in the 1930s, early 1930s, because they simply couldn't afford to pay for homes or pay for anything, and so they were forced to live in these types of situations. And you can imagine an entire family living in that, right? I mean, it's cramped space, poor living conditions, not very sanitary. It's got to be cold at night, hot in the day, right? Depending upon the season of the year, right? Deplorable conditions. Now, this is a Hoover shack. You put a bunch of them together, and let's move on to the next picture. This is what we call a Hooverville. Okay? And in fact, some of these Hoovervilles got so large, including one in St. Louis, that you began to build churches and elect mayors to these little shanty communities. I know that's just kind of funny, right? Who elects a mayor to this shanty town? But that's how bad it got. Okay? And there are tons of Great Depression pictures, right, that really attest just how difficult life became for those living in these obviously dilapidated conditions. Okay, incredible poverty, difficult times. Right, so you can obviously free to come back and take a look at these pictures as you will. So with that, let's move forward. All right, clearly attested by the pictures we just saw, Hoover's popularity is incredibly low. Again, Hoover is of the opinion that the nation should voluntarily help one another. Now, there was a couple times that Hoover attempted to provide some type of help. He passed the Hawley-Smoot tariff, but this really only hurt the American economy. In fact, 1,000 economists said, do not sign the Hawley-Smoot tariff. He did it anyways. Other types of aid that Hoover would try and would give aid to companies and corporations with the belief that the benefits of those corporations would sort of trickle down into the pockets of the general population. Okay, but the reality is that the one thing that Hoover doesn't do is he does not try to help the general person. Right? He does not try to meet people for their own specific needs, right? And so, by 1932, in addition to the Hoovervilles and the Bonus Marchers, there's this just general sense that Hoover's not going to help me. Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he's the guy that's gonna fix things. It says here the stage was set then for the election of 1932. New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the Democratic nomination on the fourth ballot of their national convention. Roosevelt promised what he called a New Deal for the American people, okay? And that included a repeal of the Prohibition Amendment, right? Again, I had mentioned earlier during the 1920s that, right, there seems to be some type of a connection between knocking out the fifth largest industry in the United States and the Great Depression, right? And of course, FDR sees that as well, and it's one of the first things he does is he ends Prohibition, right? Now, the Republicans renominated Hoover. He's going to lose. He's not going to win, of course. And Roosevelt will. And he's going to win on this idea of the New Deal. Going back to my book, America, A Narrative History, it says, in a bold gesture, Roosevelt appeared before the convention in person to accept the nomination instead of awaiting a formal notification. And he said, quote, "Let it be symbolic that I broke traditions," he told the delegates. Republican leaders not only have failed in material things, they have failed in national vision, because in disaster they have held out no hope. He said, I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people. Now, the New Deal, at this point in time, it's not very clear what that's going to be. What it eventually turns out to be is a series of congressional pieces of legislation to provide help not only to companies and loan markets, right, but to individual people. And today we still have some New Deal policies with us, including welfare and Social Security. What I want you, in fact, you need to do is to click on the Tyndall 1117 down there, and there's a film that's going to pop up, and it's going to cover what the New Deal was. So be sure to watch that and then move on to the next slide. All right, guys, let's go on. Okay, so hopefully the film was helpful in assessing and describing what the New Deal was. Of course, all of that was put into place after Roosevelt won the election, which here it says that he did, and he did so by a landslide. It says election day brought a landslide for the Democrats as Roosevelt earned 58% of the popular vote and 89% of the electoral vote, handing the Republicans their second worst defeat in the history of their political entity. It says bands across America struck up Roosevelt's theme song, Happy Days Are Here Again, as millions of Americans looked with hope toward their new leader. And of course, their new leader was going to implement the New Deal. Again, that film should have provided you an oversight of the various programs attendant with that New Deal. But it says here that the profound crisis of confidence that greeted Roosevelt when he took the oath of office on March 4th, 1933, gave way to a mood of expectancy. The new president asserted that, quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. If need be," he said, "I shall ask the Congress for broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe." And the way, of course, that he does that is via the New Deal. Again, that film demonstrated to you what that was. And of course, two very different types of ways of approaching the Great Depression. On one hand, you have voluntarism on behalf of Hoover, and then you've got the New Deal on FDR. And the one thing that really should be stressed about the New Deal and about Roosevelt's term in office is that for the first time, and I think John Green mentioned this, was that since that time there's always been this idea that the government is going to be there to provide you aid, provide Americans some type of a solution when the problem arises, whether that comes through the New Deal and various policies or organizations, right, or whether that comes in some other form. That tends to be a mainstay of Roosevelt's administration, particularly as it concerns the Great Depression. Sorry about that. All right, so Does FDR get us out of the Depression? Not really. It really takes war mobilization to do that, and that's what we'll be talking about here in the next few weeks, is about World War II, because ultimately that's what gets us out of this debacle of the Great Depression. The New Deal helps, but really more than anything, what the New Deal does is it helps to make the Great Depression more palatable in a way that Hoover was not able to do. Okay, now in addition to the Depression itself, the Depression had some very significant social consequences, right? At the same time that the Depression is going on, there's a Dust Bowl that has occurred in the American Midwest. You've got farms that are just turning to dust in Arkansas and Oklahoma, and you get the Okies and the Arkies moving across or migrating into California in search of work because either they couldn't afford to pay back loans on their farms, or their farms, for ecological reasons, turned to dust. Their narratives are actually told by a number of authors, including one in a book called The Grapes of Wrath, which you may have read, and Steinbeck, right? Very significant works there. So the Depression impacted not only the economy, but it also had an impact on society as well, and ultimately, thanks to FDR and his New Deal, politics and America's perception of government. Okay. Following this are three pictures just of the Great Depression. There's tons of pictures that are out there. Please take a look at those pictures and just get a sense, again, a feel for what people were living like and what life must have been like as they dealt with this catastrophe. So, all right, guys, with that, that's all we got to say about the Depression. Obviously, there's more information in your textbook that can elaborate on all this, so please make sure you're looking at that. Otherwise, go in peace, be warm and filled, and may the Force be with you. Have a good day.